The fading amber sun cast long, melancholic shadows across the desolate plains of Oakhaven, where the relentless wind carried the bitter scent of dust and broken promises. On the porch of a decaying homestead stood Clara Linwood, a strikingly beautiful yet slender widow whose graceful silhouette masked a heart heavy with a crushing, unspoken secret. Society had turned its back on her, leaving her to drown in a sea of isolation and unpayable debts left behind by a reckless past. But out of the rising dust rode a towering figure, a rugged and handsome cowboy named Silas Vance, whose warm presence was about to change a forgotten world forever. Welcome to Cowboy Echoes, where we invite you to journey with us into this poignant story of redemption and hope by subscribing to our channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments below as our tale unfolds into the frontier night. The morning sun climbed over the jagged peaks of the Whispering Ridge, bleeding a pale, unforgiving light across the desolate expanse of Clara Linwood's solitary world. She stood by the weathered wooden fence of the homestead, her slender fingers tracing the deep grooves of the rotting timber. Clara was a woman of striking, delicate beauty, possessing the kind of quiet, ethereal grace that seemed entirely out of place against the harsh, punishing backdrop of the western frontier. Her raven hair, though pinned hastily back to endure the grueling labor of the day, framed a face sculpted by profound sorrow, with deep, soulful eyes that held the silent tragedies of 1,000 lonely nights. It had been over a year since her husband, Arthur, had been claimed by a sudden, violent fever, leaving her with nothing but a sprawling, decaying ranch and a toxic legacy of ruin. Arthur had been a man of grandiose dreams and hollow, desperate promises, gambling away their future in the dimly lit saloons of Oakhaven long before the sickness ever took him. He had borrowed heavily against their land, their remaining cattle, and their very honor, shaking hands with ruthless men who now viewed Clara not as a grieving widow, deserving of mercy, but as a fragile obstacle standing between them and what they believed was rightfully theirs. As the wind whipped across the barren yard, pulling at the frayed edges of her simple calico dress, Clara felt a familiar, heavy weight of complete isolation settle over her fragile shoulders. The townsfolk of Oakhaven had made their judgment swiftly and without a shred of compassion. To the respectable women who gathered on the shaded, pristine porches of Main Street, she was a pariah, a living cautionary tale of a woman who had failed to keep her household righteous. To the men, she was a vulnerable liability, a stunning but broken thing to be pitied from afar or exploited in the shadows. Just 2 days prior, she had made the arduous journey into Oakhaven to trade her last dozen eggs for a meager sack of flour. The memory was seared into her mind like a hot iron brand. As she had walked down the dusty thoroughfare, the vibrant, neighborly chatter of the mercantile had abruptly ceased, replaced by a suffocating, judgmental silence. The women she had once shared warm cider with during harvest festivals now pulled their heavy skirts closer, averting their eyes as if misfortune were a contagious disease that could be caught upon the wind. Clara had kept her chin held high, her dark eyes fixed straight ahead, but beneath her stoic facade, her spirit had fractured just a little bit more. The profound cruelty of their collective silence was a heavy stone she carried all the way back to the desolate valley, reinforcing the deeply rooted, toxic belief that she was fundamentally flawed, a woman entirely unworthy of love, respect, or a peaceful life. She moved slowly toward the old barn, the rhythmic creak of the heavy wooden door echoing like a mournful in the quiet, empty valley. Inside, the air was thick with the comforting scent of dry hay and old leather, offering a fleeting, hollow illusion of safety against the outside world. Clara worked with a quiet, desperate rhythm, tending to the few remaining horses that had not yet been seized by the aggressive creditors. Her movements were graceful but terribly strained, reflecting the deep physical and emotional exhaustion that had become her constant, unyielding companion. She did not mind the grueling physical labor, for the deep ache in her muscles was a welcome, necessary distraction from the sharp, suffocating agony taking root in her heart. Every corner of the decaying homestead was a cruel reminder of her precarious, terrifying existence. Stuffed inside a rusted iron tin beneath the floorboards of her modest kitchen lay the mounting stack of collection notices, each one bearing the heavy black ink of men who demanded payments she could never hope to provide. She had tried absolutely everything to save the farm, sewing late into the cold night until her eyes burned and her fingers bled, selling off precious, delicate heirlooms that had belonged to her grandmother, and rationing her own meager meals until her waist grew terrifyingly narrow. Yet the mountain of debt only seemed to grow taller, casting a long, terrifying shadow over her every waking moment. Clara paused, resting her aching forehead against the warm, solid flank of an old chestnut mare. She closed her weary eyes, allowing a single, solitary tear to finally escape the high fortress of her composure, tracing a hot, silent path down her pale cheek. The pervasive loneliness was a physical, crushing ache in her chest, a hollow, echoing void that whispered cruel lies, telling her she would spend the rest of her days fading into this unforgiving landscape, unloved, unprotected, and completely forgotten. But as she stood in the dim, dusty light of the old barn, a sudden, unfamiliar sound broke the heavy, oppressive silence of the frontier morning. It was a slow, steady, rhythmic thud of heavy hooves approaching down the long, winding dirt road that led to her isolated sanctuary. Clara stiffened, her breath catching in her throat, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird against her ribs as a fresh wave of panic washed over her. Was it another ruthless creditor riding out to demand the impossible, or the cold-hearted bank manager arriving to finally force her from the only home she had left? She stepped cautiously out of the shadows of the barn, raising a trembling, dust-covered hand to shield her eyes from the blinding morning sun. A lone rider was emerging from the shimmering heat haze on the horizon, his broad, imposing silhouette moving with a deliberate, unhurried power that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. Who was this towering, mysterious stranger riding into her shattered, lonely world? And what new devastation was he bringing to her already broken doorstep? The lone rider drew closer, the rhythmic, heavy thud of his horse's hooves breaking the suffocating stillness of the morning and sending a cloud of golden dust rising into the crisp, unforgiving air. Clara stood frozen by the weathered fence, her slender fingers gripping the splintering wood so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, absolute white. Every instinct honed by months of cruelty and isolation screamed at her to retreat into the dark safety of the barn, to hide her delicate, exhausted frame from the judging eyes of whatever harsh messenger the town of Oakhaven had sent to torment her today. Yet, a stubborn, lingering sliver of pride, the last remaining fragment of the woman she used to be, forced her to hold her ground and lift her chin as the towering silhouette finally solidified into the shape of a man. He was a man carved from the very same rugged, unyielding mountains that loomed on the western horizon. As he pulled gently on the leather reins to halt his massive, muscular roan stallion, Clara felt the sheer, overwhelming presence of him settle over the homestead. Silas Vance was broad-shouldered and imposing, wearing a coat of worn, dust-covered canvas that spoke 1,000 miles spent under the relentless prairie sun. His wide-brimmed hat cast a deep shadow over the strong, chiseled angles of his jaw, but it could not hide the striking steel-blue clarity of his eyes. When his gaze met hers, Clara braced herself for the familiar, agonizing burn of predatory judgment or the cold dismissal she had learned to expect from every man in the valley. Instead, she found a profound, unwavering stillness. Silas did not look at her as if she were a broken, pitiful thing, nor did his eyes rake over her striking beauty with the dark, calculating hunger she despised. He looked at her with a quiet, steady respect, a gentle acknowledgment of her humanity that caught Clara entirely off guard, making her fragile heart flutter violently against her ribs in a confusing, terrifying mixture of dormant hope and fresh panic. He touched the brim of his hat, his movement slow and deeply courteous. "Morning, ma'am," he spoke, and his voice was a deep, resonant rumble, smoother than worn saddle leather and warmer than the morning sun that had just begun to thaw the frost from the ground. "Pardon the intrusion on your quiet morning. I am a stranger to these parts, traveling down from the high country, and I find myself in need of a well to water my mount, and perhaps a day of honest labor to earn a warm meal." Clara swallowed hard, the dry, bitter taste of fear coating her throat. She instinctively took a small step back, wrapping her arms around her slender waist in a defensive, protective posture that only highlighted the heartbreaking fragility of her situation. "Sir, I have no money to pay a hired hand," she replied, her voice trembling slightly despite her desperate efforts to sound firm and resolute. "This land provides barely enough for one, and I have absolutely nothing of value to offer you in exchange for your time. You would fare much better continuing on to Oak Haven, where the men have deep pockets and plenty of work for a strong back." A slow, disarming smile touched the corners of Silas's mouth, softening the fierce, rugged lines of his weathered face and sending a sudden, involuntary shiver of warmth down Clara's spine. "I have never placed much value on the heavy coins in a man's pocket, ma'am," he said gently, gracefully swinging his tall, powerful frame down from the saddle. His boots hit the dusty earth with a heavy, deliberate thud, cementing his undeniable presence in her lonely world. He casually looped the reins over the fence post, his movements possessing a fluid, quiet confidence. "A cool drink of fresh water from your well and a simple slice of bread would be a king's ransom to A, man who has eaten nothing but trail dust for 3 days. Besides, I could not help but notice the heavy iron hinge on your barn door has completely pulled away from the rotting timber. A gentle wind could tear it down, and it is far too heavy a burden for a lady to manage on her own." Clara stared at him, utterly bewildered by his gentle persistence and the complete absence of malice in his tone. No one had offered to help her with a single chore since the day they lowered her husband into the cold, uncaring earth. The sheer novelty of his kindness was terrifying, breaking against the high, defensive walls she had built around her shattered spirit. Reluctantly, feeling the intense magnetic pull of his quiet strength, she gave a slow, hesitant nod. "There's fresh water in the kitchen," she murmured softly, her eyes darting away from his intense, comforting gaze. "I will fetch a pitcher for you and see what meager scraps I can find in the pantry." As Clara turned and retreated toward the decaying sanctuary of the farmhouse, she could feel the heavy, protective weight of his eyes following her, not with menace, but with a quiet, observant concern. She stepped quickly over the threshold, leaning back against the heavy wooden door for a fleeting moment as a sudden, overwhelming wave of exhaustion washed over her trembling frame. The effort of maintaining her stoic facade was draining the very life from her bones. She moved hastily across the dim, familiar confines of her kitchen, her hand shaking as she reached for a clean glass pitcher resting on the counter. but in her nervous, desperate haste to return to the porch and ensure the towering stranger did not overstep his bounds. Her worn leather boot caught against the uneven edge of the loose floorboard near the hearth. She stumbled forward, her knee hitting the solid wood with a sharp, echoing thud. The sudden impact dislodged the hidden floorboard entirely, and beneath it, the rusted iron tin that contained her darkest nightmares was violently jolted from its resting place. The lid sprang open with a harsh, metallic clatter, spilling a massive, chaotic cascade of harsh, menacing debt notices, bank demands, and final foreclosure warnings across the worn, sun-bleached floorboards. Clara gasped, the sound tearing from her throat like a physical wound. She dropped to her knees, scrambling with desperate, trembling hands to gather the vile papers, treating them as if they were venomous serpents ready to strike. The heavy black ink on the thick parchment seemed to mock her, screaming the crushing reality of her complete ruin and her absolute unworthiness to the silent room. Tears of hot, searing humiliation blurred her vision as she frantically tried to shove the evidence of her tragic life back into the rusted tin, her breath coming in short, panicked, ragged gasps. Then a massive shadow fell across the sunlit doorway. Clara froze in absolute, paralyzing terror, the breath knocked completely from her lungs. Silas stood in the open threshold, having heard the sharp clatter, and rushed to see if she had injured herself. His broad shoulders filled the entire frame of the door, completely blocking out the morning sun. His keen, observant eyes instantly swept over her trembling, kneeling form and fell upon the scattered, damning papers that lay exposed in the light. The thick, unmistakable seal of the Oakhaven Bank was entirely visible, declaring a debt so massive it would take 3 lifetimes of grueling labor to repay. The deepest, most shameful secret of her ruined existence lay entirely exposed before this imposing, rugged stranger. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable, crushing blow to her dignity. She waited for the look of disgust, the cruel smirk of pity, or the cold, calculating shift in his demeanor that always followed when the men of Oakhaven realized just how desperate, unprotected, and utterly vulnerable she truly was. She waited for him to turn his back on her, just as the rest of the world had done. But Silas did not turn away, nor did he offer any empty, hollow apologies for his intrusion. The heavy, suffocating silence stretched between them, thick with an unspoken, charged tension. Slowly, deliberately, Silas stepped across the threshold, his heavy boots making no sound on the wooden floor. What would this towering, mysterious cowboy do with the crushing truth of her shattered world? And could her fragile, wounded heart possibly survive whatever he planned to say next? Clara remained frozen on the cold hardwood floor, the jagged splinters of the loose boards pressing sharply into her knees, though the physical sting was entirely eclipsed by the agonizing humiliation tearing through her chest. The morning sunlight, which had only moments ago felt like a gentle blessing, now poured through the open doorway like a harsh, unforgiving spotlight, illuminating the chaotic scatter of foreclosure notices and aggressive bank demands. She kept her head bowed deeply, her dark, silken hair falling forward to hide the hot tears of absolute shame that threatened to spill over her eyelashes. She could hear the slow, deliberate intake of breath from the towering cowboy standing in the threshold, and she braced her fragile spirit for the heavy boots to turn away, for the sound of his spurs to fade into the distance as he abandoned a woman so deeply drowning in ruin. But the heavy footsteps did not retreat. Instead, the floorboards creaked with a slow, purposeful weight as Silas Vance stepped fully into the dim confines of the kitchen. He brought the scent of the wild frontier with him, a clean, masculine blend of sun-baked leather, pine needles and fresh earth, completely overpowering the stale, suffocating air of her despair. Clara flinched instinctively as his massive shadow enveloped her trembling form, her slender hands frantically scraping against the wood to gather the damning papers, desperate to hide the undeniable proof of her worthlessness. Before her frantic fingers could crumple the heavy parchment, a large, deeply calloused hand reached down and gently covered hers. The sudden, shocking heat of the skin against her icy, trembling fingers sent a sharp, involuntary jolt of pure electricity straight up her arm, halting her frantic movements completely. Silas dropped smoothly to one knee beside her, his towering, muscular frame taking up an immense amount of space in the small, worn kitchen. Yet he somehow managed to project a deeply comforting, protective stillness that immediately anchored her spiraling panic. "Please," he murmured, his voice a low, incredibly soothing rumble that vibrated through the quiet room and settled directly into the hollow, aching spaces of her heart. "Do not tear your hands on the wood for the sake of a few foolish pieces of paper." Clara could not force herself to look up. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps as she stared at the stark, beautiful contrast of his massive, sun-brown hand resting gently atop her pale, delicate fingers. He was so incredibly strong, possessing a rugged, untamed power that could easily crush the world around him. Yet his touch was lighter than a falling autumn leaf, completely devoid of the rough, demanding cruelty she had come to expect from men. He slowly pulled her trembling hands away from the scattered mess, giving her a moment to breathe, to steady the violent fluttering of her pulse. Silas reached out with his other hand and began to gather the heavy, ink-stained pages himself. He did not look at them with the cruel, calculating eyes of a banker, nor did he scan the massive numerical figures that dictated her impending doom. He simply collected them with a quiet, respectful dignity, folding the stiff parchment neatly and placing it back into the rusted iron tin. The deep, agonizing secret she had guarded with her very life. The suffocating burden that had caused the entire town of Oakhaven to cast her aside as a broken, unworthy thing, was now resting entirely in the palm of a stranger. "I am sorry," Clara whispered, the words tearing painfully from her dry, constricted throat as a single, hot tear finally escaped and traced a silent path down her cheek. "You should not have seen that. You should ride away now, Mr. Vance. There is nothing but ruin here, and I have absolutely no way to pay for your labor, nor do I have the strength to pretend otherwise. I am entirely drowning, and the town is just waiting for the water to finally close over my head." Silas secured the lid of the rusted tin and set it gently aside. He did not stand up, refusing to loom over her. Instead, he shifted his weight, closing the remaining distance between them until he was close enough that Clara could feel the steady, radiating warmth of his broad chest. He reached out once more, his rough, weathered fingers gently catching her chin, exerting just enough tender pressure to lift her face. Clara squeezed her eyes tightly shut, terrified to read the pity or disgust she was certain would be waiting in his gaze. "Look at me, Clara," he said softly, speaking her name for the very first time with a deep, resonating reverence that made her fractured soul ache with sudden, impossible yearning. Slowly, her dark, tear-filled eyelashes fluttered open, meeting the intense, steel-blue clarity of his eyes. There was no pity waiting there, no arrogant judgment, and absolutely no trace of the cruel scorn she endured daily in the streets of Oakhaven. Instead, she found a fierce, unwavering storm-protective resolve, a deep, abiding warmth that seemed to see completely past the broken facade she presented to the world, reaching down to the pure, enduring beauty of her spirit. "I know your secret," he whispered, the words wrapping around her fragile heart like a thick, woolen blanket against a bitter winter wind. I see the heavy burden that coward left behind for you to carry. I see the cruelty of the people in this valley, and I see how deeply it has wounded you. But I also see a woman of incredible, staggering strength, a woman who has stood her ground against a storm that would have broken a lesser soul 1,000 times over. Clara let out a small, broken sob, her entire body trembling violently as the heavy, protective walls she had spent a year building finally began to crack and crumble under the weight of this profound, unexpected grace. No one had ever spoken to her with such gentle, piercing truth. She had spent so many agonizing months feeling entirely invisible, convinced that she was nothing more than a ruined, discarded relic of her husband's failures. Yet here was this towering, beautiful man, looking at her as if she were something precious, something incredibly rare and entirely worthy of salvation. Instead of turning away, Silas stepped closer, closing the final inch between them until his forehead nearly touched hers. His presence was a massive, impenetrable shield against the cruel world outside her door. You will never have to face this alone again, he vowed, his deep voice dropping to a harsh, fierce whisper that sent a glorious, shivering wave of heat cascading through her veins. Do you hear me? I am not riding away. I am going to fix that broken door. I am going to draw fresh water from your well. And tomorrow, we are going to look at that ledger together. The men who wrote those letters will have to answer to me before they ever speak another word of disrespect to you. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his promise robbed Clara of all her remaining words. She could only nod, her dark eyes wide and shimmering with fresh tears, completely captivated by the profound, quiet intimacy of the moment. Silas slowly withdrew his hand from her chin, his knuckles brushing briefly, agonizingly gently against the soft curve of her cheek, leaving a trail of lingering, electric heat in their wake. He stood up, his massive frame unfolding with a fluid, masculine grace, and offered his large hand to her. Clara placed her delicate, trembling hand in his. His grip was completely secure, pulling her effortlessly from the floor, as if she weighed absolutely nothing. Standing so close to him, she was acutely aware of her own slender fragility, yet she did not feel weak. For the first time in over a year, drawing upon the immense, quiet strength he so freely offered, she felt a tiny, fragile spark of genuine hope ignite in the darkest corner of her soul. Silas retrieved the fallen pitcher from the floorboards, walking over to the wash basin to rinse it clean before filling it with fresh, cool water from the indoor pump. Clara stood quietly by the hearth, wrapping her arms around her waist, watching the rhythmic, capable movements of his broad shoulders beneath the worn canvas coat. The stifling, lonely silence of the kitchen had completely transformed, replaced by a thick, heavy tension that was not born of fear, but of a deep, sudden, and terrifyingly powerful connection. He poured 2 glasses of water, placing one gently on the worn wooden table before pulling out a chair and offering her a respectful nod. Clara moved to the table, her steps slow and hesitant, completely overwhelmed by the dramatic shift in her tragic reality. She sat down, wrapping her cold hands around the glass, allowing the cool moisture to ground her racing thoughts. Silas took the seat opposite her, his large frame making the sturdy wooden chair look remarkably fragile. He drank deeply, his eyes never leaving her face, observing her with that same quiet, steady intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. They sat together in a silence that was rich and profoundly comfortable, a stark contrast to the bitter isolation Clara had known for so long. The sunlight stretched further across the floorboards, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air between them. creating a serene, almost magical atmosphere in the decaying room. Yet, beneath the newfound peace, a dark, nagging anxiety began to take root in Clara's mind. The creditors in Oakhaven were not forgiving men, and they were not men who would simply walk away because a stranger stood in their path. They were ruthless, calculated, and deeply accustomed to taking exactly what they wanted from those who could not fight back. By offering his strength and his protection, Silas had just stepped directly into the center of a very dangerous, unforgiving storm. As Clara looked across the table at the handsome, rugged cowboy who had just promised to shield her from the world, a terrifying question echoed through her mind. What violent lengths would the desperate, greedy men of this town go to when they discovered that the fragile, defenseless widow they planned to destroy was suddenly guarded by a man who refused to back down? The days that immediately followed Silas Vance's arrival brought a profound, rhythmic transformation to the desolate Linwood homestead, replacing the suffocating, heavy silence of abandonment with the steady, reassuring sounds of honest labor and quiet companionship. Silas was a man of deliberate action rather than empty words. Rising from his makeshift bed in the hayloft long before the dawn, could paint the eastern horizon in fragile shades of lavender and gold. He took upon his broad shoulders the grueling, back-breaking work of mending a farm that had been carelessly left to rot, moving with a tireless, unyielding power that breathed a sudden, vibrant life back into the dying earth. From the safety of the kitchen window, Clara would watch him, her hands buried deep in the warm, yeasty dough of morning bread, completely captivated by the sheer strength and the swing of his hammer as he expertly realigned the heavy iron hinges of the barn door, securing a sanctuary that had been broken for far too long. Every strike of iron against her felt like a definitive strike against the overwhelming despair that had consumed her life, slowly dismantling the high, lonely walls she had built around her fractured spirit. Clara found herself moving through her daily chores with a lightness she had not felt in years. The deep, chronic ache of her isolation receding like the tide to reveal a quiet, cautious blooming of hope. She no longer swept the porch with the heavy, dragging steps of a woman waiting for her doom, but with a renewed, quiet dignity, acutely aware of the towering, protective presence working just a few yards away. The profound cruelty of the townsfolk in Oakhaven still lingered like a dark stain at the edge of her memory, but it no longer possessed a power to completely paralyze her. For the harsh judgments of small-minded men meant absolutely nothing against the steady, respectful gaze of the cowboy who had chosen to stay. By the time the midday sun climbed to its highest, most punishing point in the vast frontier sky, baking the earth into a dry, cracked canvas, the physical toll of Silas's labor was evident. Clara stepped out onto the porch, carrying a fresh pitcher of cool, sweet well water and a clean linen cloth, her delicate footsteps completely silent against the hard-packed dirt of the yard. Silas was wrestling with a massive section of rotted fence line near the old corral, his heavy canvas coat discarded over a nearby post, leaving him in a simple, sweat-dampened cotton shirt that clung tight to the rugged, heavily muscled contours of his broad back and shoulders. The sheer, untamed masculinity of him, combined with the honest grit of his labor, sent a sudden, startling wave of healthy, deeply feminine awareness rushing through Clara, bringing a faint, delicate flush of color to her pale cheeks. She paused a few feet away, hesitant to interrupt his focused rhythm, but Silas sensed her quiet approach instantly. He drove the heavy wooden post deep into the earth with one final, earth-shaking blow of the mallet before turning to face her, wiping a streak of dust and sweat from his strong, chiseled brow with the back of his calloused hand. When his piercing steel blue eyes locked onto hers, the immense, Sun-drenched valleys seemed to shrink until absolutely nothing existed except the charged, magnetic space between them. Clara closed the remaining distance, offering him the glass of water with a hand that trembled ever so slightly, fiercely, intensely aware of the powerful heat radiating from his large frame. Silas took the glass, his rough fingers intentionally brushing against hers, sending a sharp, electric thrill racing straight up her arm and settling deep in her chest. He drank deeply, his throat working as the cool water quenched his thirst, his eyes never leaving her face. When he lowered the glass, he did not immediately step back into the safety of casual distance. Instead, his gaze dropped to her hands, noting the tiny, fading scars from sewing late into the night, and the faint, dusty redness of her knuckles from scrubbing floors she had believed would soon belong to someone else. "You work far too hard for a woman entirely on her own, Clara," he murmured, his deep voice carrying a rough, vibrating tenderness that made her breath catch painfully in her throat. "You have carried the weight of two men on these delicate shoulders, and you have done it with a grace that humbles me completely." Clara looked down, her heart hammering violently against her ribs, completely unaccustomed to being praised for her resilience rather than merely observed for her striking beauty or judged for her tragic circumstances. "It was simply what had to be done, Silas," she replied softly, her voice barely more than a whisper in the dry prairie wind. "Survival does not afford a woman the luxury of weakness, especially not out here, where the world is so eager to see you fall." Silas reached out, taking the clean linen cloth from her other hand. But before he used it to wipe his brow, he gently draped it over her shoulder, stepping impossibly close. "There's a vast difference between weakness and exhaustion, Clara," he said, his tone fierce and fiercely protective. "You have fought a solitary war against men who prey on vulnerability, and you have not broken. But the war is over now. You can lay your armor down. I am here to stand in the gap." The profound, breathtaking sincerity of his words shattered another heavy chain around her heart, allowing a warm, glorious rush of true healing to wash over her wounded soul. They stood there in the brilliant, unforgiving light of the western sun, enveloped in a thick, sweet tension that spoke of deep mutual respect and a quiet, undeniably romantic yearning that neither was quite ready to voice, yet both felt in the very marrow of their bones. When evening finally fell, casting long, cool shadows across the valley and painting the sky in deep hues of indigo and bruised purple, the homestead felt entirely transformed into a place of genuine refuge. Clara prepared a simple meal of roasted root vegetables and the last of the salted beef, serving it on the worn wooden table that now felt like the center of a true home rather than a lonely island of despair. Silas ate with profound, quiet gratitude, praising her meager cooking as if she had set a royal feast before him, entirely restoring the deep, intrinsic sense of self-worth that the town of Oakhaven had systematically tried to destroy. After the plates were cleared, Silas did not retreat to the barn. Instead, he asked Clara to bring the rusted iron tin to the table. He lit a second kerosene lamp, bathing the kitchen in a warm, golden glow, and began to carefully unfold the harsh, damning collection notices and heavy banking ledgers her late husband had desperately tried to hide. Clara sat beside him, her slender hands clutched tightly in her lap, bracing herself for the familiar, suffocating wave of shame that always accompanied the sight of those staggering numbers. But as Silas meticulously traced the dates, the interest rates, and the crude, demanding signatures of the town's most prominent men, his strong jaw tightened in cold, quiet anger. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a callous finger against the thickest document, a foreclosure warning sign by a man named Elias Thorne. the wealthiest and most ruthless merchant in Oakhaven. These numbers are complete fabrication, Clara, Silas stated, his voice devoid of any judgment toward her, but heavy with a dangerous brewing storm directed entirely at the man who had written the letters. Your husband was a foolish man for taking the initial coin, yes, but Thorne and his associates have compounded the interest at a rate that is completely illegal, manufacturing a debt designed specifically to be unpayable. They did not lend money to help a struggling rancher. They laid a trap to steal this fertile land, knowing full well that a grieving widow would not have the legal knowledge or the standing to fight them in a court of law. Clara stared at him, her dark eyes wide with shock as the heavy, oppressive fog of personal failure suddenly lifted, replaced by a sharp, righteous clarity. You mean to say, she breathed, her voice trembling with the magnitude of the revelation, that I am not truly ruined? That they have been lying to me, shaming me in the streets, all to steal my home? Silas turned his chair, facing her completely, his massive knees nearly brushing against her skirts. They saw a beautiful, unprotected woman, and they believed they could break your spirit to take what is yours, he said, his voice dropping to a rough, intimate rumble that sent a fierce, protective heat rushing through her veins. But they severely underestimated the strength of the woman they were trying to break, and they certainly did not account for me riding into this valley. He reached across the table, his large, warm hand completely enveloping both of her cold, trembling hands. The subtle, healthy intimacy of his touch was deeply grounding, an anchor in the sudden, swirling storm of her newfound reality. The deep emotional pain of feeling entirely unworthy and invisible dissolved entirely under the fierce, unwavering light of his devotion. We will ride into Oakhaven together, Silas vowed, his thumb gently stroking the delicate skin of her knuckles. And we will lay this truth bare before the entire town. You will never hang your head in shame again, Clara. That night, as Clara lay in her small bed, listening to the comforting, steady sound of Silas's footsteps pacing the porch on his final watch before sleeping, her heart swelled with a powerful, unfamiliar courage. She was no longer a tragic, discarded thing waiting to be crushed by a cruel world. She was a woman fiercely protected, deeply valued, and standing on the precipice of a terrifying but beautiful new life. But out in the vast, unforgiving darkness of the frontier, the world was not willing to let her go so easily. Just before dawn, the sharp, unmistakable sound of a heavy wooden post snapping in the distance shattered the peaceful silence of the valley. Clara bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering wildly in her chest as a heavy, rapid thud of receding hoofbeats echoed into the night. She rushed to the window, peering into the gloom, only to see the faint, glowing embers of a small, deliberate fire burning near the entrance to her property. The ruthless men of Oakhaven had realized she was no longer alone, and they were sending a clear, violent message. What dark, desperate measures would Elias Thorne take when he realized his grand, cruel theft was being challenged by a man who possessed the wild, untamed strength of the western frontier? And how far would Silas have to go to keep his promise to protect her? The acrid scent of wood smoke hung thick and heavy in the fragile pre-dawn air. A bitter intrusion upon the sanctuary Silas had so carefully begun to rebuild. Clara stood trembling on the edge of the porch, her slender arms wrapped tightly around her thin cotton nightgown, watching as Silas swiftly and methodically smothered the smoldering embers of the warning fire with heavy shovelfuls of dry earth. The flames hissed and died, but the malicious intent behind them continued to burn brightly in Clara's terrified mind. The ruthless men of Oakhaven were not merely sending a message, they were promising destruction. reminding her that the invisible cage they had built around her life was shrinking tighter with every passing hour. Silas drove the iron blade of the shovel deep into the dirt and turned back toward the cabin, his broad chest rising and falling with a slow, controlled rhythm. The rising sun caught the hard, uncompromising lines of his jaw, highlighting a quiet, lethal anger that was a stark contrast of profound gentleness he had shown her the night before. He crossed the yard in long, deliberate strides, climbing the wooden steps to where Clara stood shivering in the morning chill, without a single word. He unfastened the heavy canvas coat he had thrown over his shoulders and wrapped it carefully around her fragile frame, pulling the collar tight against the biting wind. Clara immediately felt the lingering heat of his skin completely envelop her, a powerful, grounding warmth that smelled of pine and masculine strength. But even his magnificent presence could not stop the violent trembling in her hands. "You cannot stay here, Silas," she whispered, her voice fracturing under the sheer weight of her terror. "You saw what they did. Elias Thorne is a man who builds his fortune on the ruins of others, and he commands every ruthless soul in that town. He will not allow a stranger to humiliate him, and he will absolutely not let this land slip through his fingers. If you stand beside me, he will destroy you too." Silas reached out, his large, calloused hands resting gently on her shoulders, holding her steady against the rising tide of her panic. His touch was an anchor in the chaotic storm of her mind, radiating an unwavering, immovable resolve. "Clara, look into my eyes," he commanded softly, his deep voice slicing through the icy grip of her fear. She lifted her chin, her dark, tear-filled gaze meeting the fierce, steel-blue intensity of his. "Do I look like a man who runs from a fight built on cowardly lies? You do not understand the depth of their cruelty," she pleaded, a solitary tear escaping to trace a hot path down her pale cheek. "They have spent a year ensuring that I am completely isolated, whispering poison until my own name sounds like a curse in the streets. I am a shattered woman, carrying a mountain of ruin. Silas, I have absolutely nothing to offer you but the heavy chains of a dead man's mistakes. Please, I could not bear it if your goodness was punished because you try to save a woman who is already drowning." The profound, agonizing vulnerability in her confession hung in the quiet air, a heartbreaking testament to the deep emotional wounds she carried. Silas did not flinch, nor did he offer empty platitudes. Instead, he moved closer, pulling her gently against the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. He wrapped his massive arms around her, completely shielding her from the harsh, waking world. Clara rested her cheek against his chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart, entirely overwhelmed by the astonishing realization that he was not pulling away from her darkness, but choosing to stand directly inside it with her. "You are not drowning, Clara," he murmured, his breath warm against the crown of her hair, "and you are not a shattered thing. You are the most beautiful, courageous woman I have ever known. And the fact that those foolish men cannot see your true worth is their failure, not yours. I am not a wealthy man, but I possess a strength forged in the highest mountains, and I vow to you right now, I will spend every ounce of it to tear down the walls they have built around you. You are no longer fighting this war alone." For a long, suspended moment, Clara allowed herself to completely surrender to the fierce, protective embrace of the towering cowboy. The subtle, entirely pure intimacy of the moment filled her battered soul with a radiant, healing light. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, feeling a terrifyingly beautiful emotion taking root in the deepest, most guarded corners of her heart. It was the undeniable spark of true love, blooming amidst the barren ash of her former life. But the fragile peace of their shared sanctuary was destined to be short-lived. by the time the sun had reached its punishing zenith, baking the vast prairie into a shimmering canvas of heat. A thick cloud of golden dust appeared on the horizon. The heavy, rhythmic thud of multiple horses galloping toward the homestead shattered the quiet afternoon. Clara felt the blood drain completely from her face as she stepped out onto the porch, her hands instantly gripping the wooden railing for support. 3 riders pulled into the yard, their horses lathered and breathless. At the center sat Elias Thorne, a sharp, impeccably dressed man who's cold. Calculating eyes swept over the decaying property, with an air of absolute ownership. Flanking him were 2 heavily armed men, hired muscle with cruel faces and hands resting casually near the iron of their holstered revolvers. The sheer, suffocating weight of the town's malice had finally arrived at her doorstep. Thorne did not dismount, choosing instead to remain elevated in his saddle, forcing Clara to look up at him. A deliberate, psychological tactic meant to reinforce her profound insignificance. "Well, Mrs. Linwood," Thorne began, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension that made Clara's stomach turn. "I see you have failed to heed the numerous legal notices delivered to this property. The bank has been remarkably patient with your unfortunate circumstances, but that patience has officially run completely dry." Clara forced herself to stand tall, refusing to cower, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "The notices were based on fraudulent mathematics, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "My husband was a foolish man, but even his debts could not possibly amount to the staggering sum you claim I owe." Thorne let out a sharp, mocking laugh, the sound grating against the quiet dignity of the valley. "A desperate widow clinging to desperate delusions," he sneered, his cold eyes narrowing into dark slits. "Your husband was a degenerate gambler who signed away his soul and your future on the tables of my saloon. You are a pariah, Clara. You have no friends, you have no money, and you have absolutely no standing in the town of Oakhaven. Your fragile beauty might have blinded Arthur Linwood, but it holds absolutely no currency with the bank. You are entirely ruined." The cruel, targeted words struck Clara like physical blows, reopening every deep, festering wound of unworthiness she had spent the past week trying to heal. The absolute certainty in Thorne's voice threatened to plunge her straight back into the dark, suffocating abyss of despair. She felt a sudden, terrifying urge to simply collapse onto the dusty floorboards and surrender to the inevitable crushing weight of her fate. But before the heavy silence could completely drown her, the heavy barn door swung open with a violent, resounding crash. Silas stepped out into the blazing sunlight, the heavy iron mallet still resting casually in his massive grip. He did not rush, but his long, deliberate strides consumed the distance between the barn and the porch with terrifying speed. The 2 hired men instantly stiffened, their hands hovering dangerously close to their weapons. Entirely unnerved by the sheer, imposing magnitude of the towering cowboy approaching them, Silas ignored them completely, his piercing, steel-blue eyes locked entirely on the wealthy merchant in the saddle. He stepped directly in front of the porch steps, placing his broad, immovable frame firmly between Clara and the men who sought to destroy her. The air in the yard grew instantly thick and heavy, charged with lethal, impending violence. "I suggest you watch the tone you take with this lady," Silas stated, his voice incredibly low, yet carried a harsh, vibrating authority that completely commanded the open space. "And you had best dismount if you wish to conduct business on her land." Thorne sneered, looking down his nose at the dust-covered cowboy. "And who might you be?" "Another drifting fool looking to scavenge what is left of this miserable estate? This is a legal matter concerning the Bank of Oakhaven. Stranger, step aside, or my men will remove you by force." Silas slowly rested the heavy head of the iron mallet against the sun-baked earth, leaning his massive weight against the wooden handle. His posture was entirely relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, lethal daggers. "My name is Silas Vance," he replied calmly, the absolute stillness in his voice far more terrifying than any shout. "I have reviewed your ledgers. Thorne, I have seen the impossible interest rates and the forged dates. You are not conducting legal business. You are attempting theft under the thin veil of the law, using intimidation against a woman who was left entirely unprotected. But she is unprotected no longer." A dangerous, suffocating silence fell over the yard. Thorne's face twisted into an ugly, hateful sneer. Realizing his easy conquest had suddenly become a formidable, deeply dangerous war, he gathered his reins, hauling his nervous horse backward. "You possess a bold tongue for a man with absolutely nothing to his name. Vance." Thorne spat, his voice trembling with unchecked fury. "But boldness does not pay debts. I will give you until sunset tomorrow. If the sum is not paid in full, in gold, I will return to the sheriff and every able-bodied man in Oakhaven. We will drag you both from this land, and I will see to it that you burn for challenging me." With a vicious yank on the reins, Thorne spun his horse around, galloping furiously back toward the dusty horizon, his hired men following closely behind. Clara stood frozen on the porch, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the dust slowly settled back onto the barren earth. The darkest moment of her tragic existence had finally arrived, entirely eclipsing the fragile hope that had just begun to bloom in her heart. Elias Thorne demanded an impossible fortune by sunset, and he possessed the power to bring the entire wrath of the town crashing down upon them. Silas turned to face her, his strong features etched with quiet determination. But Clara could only see the impending, terrifying ruin. He was a good, honorable man with a brave heart, but how could a single, solitary cowboy with empty pockets possibly conjure a miracle capable of defeating the wealthiest, most corrupt man in the entire territory? And how would they survive the violent storm that was destined to arrive with tomorrow's fading sun? The long, agonizing night stretched before Clara like an endless desert of terrifying shadows. Every ticking second of the old mantel clock dragging her closer to the impending ruin of the sunset deadline. She paced the worn wooden floorboards of the dim kitchen, her slender arms wrapped tightly around her chest, completely unable to calm the violent, freezing tremors that racked her fragile frame. The suffocating weight of Elias Thorne's threat hung in the stale air, a cruel, heavy blanket that threatened to extinguish the very last flicker of hope in her battered soul. She had spent a year learning how to survive the cold indifference of the world, but the thought of Silas, this beautiful, honorable man who had shown her the only true kindness she had ever known, being dragged into the violent mud of her tragic existence, was an agony she could simply not endure. Silas sat quietly by the stone hearth, his massive frame completely still as he watched the dying orange embers of the fire paint long, dancing shadows across his rugged features. He did not possess the frantic, desperate energy of a man facing his doom. Instead, he radiated profound, deeply unsettling calm, the dangerous tranquility of a seasoned warrior who had already calculated every move on the battlefield and knew exactly how the war would end. He watched Clara pace, his steel-blue eyes tracking her delicate, frantic movements with a profound, unwavering tenderness that completely contrasted the lethal anger he had displayed in the yard just hours before. Clara finally stopped, her dark, exhausted eyes turning to him in pure desperation. "You must saddle your horse while the valley is still dark, Silas," she pleaded, her voice a fragile, broken whisper that tore at the quiet room. You have done more for my spirit in these past few days than anyone has done in a lifetime, but you cannot fight the entire town of Oakhaven with nothing but a heavy hammer and a brave heart. Thorne controls the sheriff. He controls the bank. And he controls the men who will gladly burn this homestead to the ground just to please him. I will not allow your blood to be spilled on this cursed dirt because of my husband's sins. Please, I am begging you, ride away before the morning sun finds you here." Silas slowly leaned forward, resting his heavy, callous forearms on his knees. He did not immediately speak, allowing the sheer, terrifying weight of her confession to settle into the quiet room. Then, with a fluid, deliberate grace, he reached into the deep inner pocket of his worn canvas coat and withdrew a thick, tightly bound leather satchel. The leather was ancient and heavily scarred, bearing the unmistakable marks of 1,000 miles traveled across unforgiving terrain. He tossed it gently onto the wooden kitchen table, the heavy, muffled thud completely shattering the silence of the room. "I told you that I am not a wealthy man. Clara," Silas began, his deep, resonant voice filling the hollow spaces of her fear with a warm, steady vibration. "And by the standards of men like Elias Thorne, men who measure their worth in stolen land and hoarded silver, I am not. But I did not ride down from the high country as a desperate drifter looking for a meager meal. For 10 brutal years, I drove massive herds of cattle across the Wyoming territories, breaking wild horses and sleeping in the frozen dirt until I built a sprawling ranch that rivaled the mountains themselves." Clara stared at the heavy leather satchel, her breath catching painfully in her throat as the sheer, staggering reality of his words began to wash over her. Silas stood up, taking the 2 short steps required to close the distance between them, his towering presence completely enveloping her in a fortress of masculine heat and unyielding protection. "When the cholera swept through the valley and took my family, the massive ranch became nothing more than an empty, echoing tomb," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a rough, intimate rumble, revealing profound emotional wound that mirrored her own tragic past. "I sold every acre, every head of cattle, and every piece of timber to the federal government, trading a lifetime of grueling labor for the heavy gold certificates inside that satchel. I rode south looking for a quiet valley where a man could plant a new foundation, a place where the soil was fertile enough to grow a true home, and a place where the air was completely free of the toxic greed that poisons the world." He reached out, his rough knuckles gently tracing the soft, pale curve of her trembling jawline, sending a fierce, electric shock of pure life straight through her veins. "I found that valley, Clara," he whispered, his eyes blazing with a fierce, terrifying devotion. "And I found the woman I want to build that home with. The money inside that satchel is more than enough to completely bury Elias Thorne and his fraudulent ledgers 10 times over. I am not running from this fight, because this is no longer just your land. It is our future, and I will defend it with every last breath of my lungs." The profound, earth-shattering magnitude of his confession broke the final, stubborn chain around Clara's deeply wounded heart. The hot tears she had fought so desperately to hold back finally spilled over her dark eyelashes. Not tears of shame or terror, but tears of overwhelming, radiant salvation. He was offering her absolute redemption, entirely erasing the toxic, suffocating lie that she was an invisible, unworthy burden. She leaned into his touch, burying her face against the warm, solid expanse of his broad chest, allowing his massive arms to completely encircle her, holding her together as the shattered pieces of her soul finally began to knit themselves back into a beautiful, resilient whole. When the morning sun finally broke across the eastern ridges, burning away the lingering chill of the night, the Linwood homestead was no longer a decaying monument to despair. It was the staging ground for a glorious, righteous resurrection. Clara emerged from the farmhouse wearing her finest, most respectable dress, a simple but elegantly tailored garment of deep indigo cotton that she had meticulously saved for a day of dignity she believed would never arrive. Her raven hair was pinned perfectly into place, framing a face that had completely shed the hollow, haunted look of a victim, replaced by the striking, breathtaking radiance of a woman who fully understood her own infinite worth. Silas stood waiting by the old wooden wagon, having hitched the massive roan stallion to the worn leather traces. He had brushed the travel dust from his broad shoulders and wore a clean, pressed cotton shirt that highlighted the rugged, untamed nobility of his posture. As he reached out his large, capable hand to help Clara up onto the wooden bench, his eyes swept over her with a deep, reverent admiration that made her skin tingle with a healthy, completely pure sensual heat. They rode toward Oak Haven not as a terrified widow and a drifting laborer, but as an unbreakable, unified front, heading straight into the heart of the storm. The dusty, sun-baked thoroughfare of Oak Haven fell completely, unervingly silent as the heavy wagon rolled slowly past the mercantile and the saloon. The townsfolk, who had spent a year eagerly participating in Clara's cruel isolation, stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sudden, uneasy guilt. They stared at the towering, formidable cowboy holding the reins with effortless, commanding power. But mostly, they stared at the incredibly beautiful, slender woman sitting beside him, her spine completely straight, her chin held high, radiating a quiet, invincible grace that demanded absolute respect. Silas brought the wagon to a deliberate halt directly in front of the Oak Haven Bank, the heavy wooden wheels kicking up a small cloud of golden dust that settled over the pristine boardwalk. He stepped down, his heavy boots echoing like thunder against the wood, and walked around to offer Clara his hand. The subtle, protective intimacy of his gesture, right in front of the judging eyes of the town, was a powerful, undeniable declaration of his devotion. They stepped through the polished mahogany doors of the bank, leaving the blinding afternoon sun behind. The opulent interior was cool and completely silent, smelling of expensive cigar smoke and imported leather. Elias Thorne sat behind a massive oak desk at the back of the room, flanked by the nervous, sweating bank manager. Thorne's smug, arrogant smile vanished instantly the moment he saw the absolute lack of fear in Clara's striking eyes, replaced by a dark, sudden confusion as he registered the lethal, unwavering calm radiating from the towering cowboy at her side. "You are a remarkably foolish man to show your face in this town, Vance," Thorne sneered, standing up and leaning his heavy knuckles against the polished wood of his desk, attempting to project an authority that was rapidly crumbling under Silas's imposing shadow. "The sun has not yet set, but my men are already saddling their horses. I warned you what would happen if you failed to produce the gold." Silas completely ignored the merchant's hollow posturing. He walked straight to the center of the room, his movements slow, deliberate, and radiating a massive, dangerous power. He reached into his coat, retrieving the heavy leather satchel, and dropped it onto the pristine mahogany counter with a violent, resounding crash that made the bank manager flinch backward in terror. "I have reviewed the original loan documents signed by Arthur Linwood," Silas stated, his deep voice carrying a harsh, vibrating authority that completely commanded the silent room, ensuring that every patron and clerk heard his exact words. The principal amount borrowed was entirely legitimate, and that exact sum, along with a fair, federally mandated interest rate, is inside that pouch, paid in fully certified gold drafts from the Wyoming Territorial Reserve. Thorne's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson. "You have no legal standing to dictate the terms of my interest, you insolent drifter," he spat, his voice trembling with unchecked fury. "The debt stands at the sum I demanded, and not a single penny less." Silas leaned forward, placing his massive, calloused hands flat on the counter, his broad shoulders completely blocking the light from the large front windows. His steel-blue eyes locked onto Thorne with the lethal, unblinking intensity of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "The interest you demanded was calculated entirely on fraudulent dates and predatory. Illegal mathematics designed specifically to force a widow into destitution." Silas growled softly, the absolute stillness in his tone far more terrifying than a shout. "You will accept this fair payment. You will immediately sign over the deed to the Linwood property in Clara's name entirely free and clear, and you will surrender every forged document in your possession. If you refuse, I will ride this federal draft directly to the territorial marshals in the capital. I will hand them your fabricated ledgers, and I will personally watch them drag you out of this bank in iron chains for extortion and fraud." The heavy, suffocating silence in the bank stretched out to the absolute breaking point. The townsfolk who had gathered near the doorway murmured in shocked, uncomfortable whispers, finally forced to confront the dark, ugly reality of the man they had allowed to rule their town, and the horrific cruelty they had inflicted upon an innocent woman. Thorne stared at the heavy leather satchel, his jaw clenching in impotent rage, completely outmaneuvered, outclassed, and entirely defeated by a man who possessed 10 times his wealth in moral courage alone. With a shaking, defeated hand, Thorne snatched the gold draft from the counter, nodding furiously to the terrified bank manager, who immediately rushed to retrieve the property deed and the heavy iron seal. Clara watched in absolute, breathless awe as the horrific, suffocating mountain of debt that had entirely consumed her existence was dismantled in mere minutes by the righteous, towering strength of the man she loved. When the manager pushed the freshly stamped, perfectly clear deed across the counter, Silas did not take it. He stepped back, offering Clara a gentle, respectful nod, deferring the ultimate victory entirely to her. Clara stepped forward, her slender fingers tracing the heavy black ink that finally, unequivocally declared her absolute freedom. She picked up the parchment, turning to look directly into Elias Thorne's defeated, venomous eyes. "You thought you could bury me under the weight of my husband's failures, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice ringing out clear, steady, and magnificently triumphant in the silent room. "But you forgot that some women are born from the same earth as the mountains, and we do not break easily. You will never speak my name again." Silas placed his warm, large hand gently against the small of her back, guiding her out of the suffocating bank and back into the brilliant, blinding light of the afternoon sun. The townsfolk on the boardwalk parted immediately, lowering their eyes in deep, profound shame as the beautiful, victorious widow and her towering protector walked back to their wagon. The cruel, invisible cage had been completely shattered, leaving Clara entirely free to breathe the sweet, untainted air of a magnificent new beginning. But as they rode the slow, creaking wagon back out toward the isolated, wind-swept valley, moving away from the town and into the vast, beautiful expanse of their shared future, a quiet, profound realization settled deeply into Clara's trembling heart. The terrifying battle against the town was over, and the land was finally safe. But the most profound journey was only just beginning. Silas had poured his entire life savings, his fierce protection, and his incredibly pure heart entirely into her hands. As she looked sideways at his handsome, Rugged profile bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, the ultimate question remained. Could a woman who had spent so long believing she was entirely unlovable finally find the terrifying, beautiful courage required to completely surrender her fragile soul to the magnificent, forever love of this perfect cowboy? The heavy wooden wheels of the wagon turned with a slow, rhythmic groan as they left the dusty borders of Oakhaven behind, venturing deep into the vast, open embrace of the prairie where the air tasted clean and entirely untainted by the bitter malice of men. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow, majestic descent, painting the endless sky in brilliant strokes of melted copper, soft rose, and deep violet, casting a warm, forgiving light across the rolling hills. Clara sat on the wooden bench, the heavy parchment of the property deed resting securely in her lap, her slender fingers tracing the raised ridges of the official bank seal that guaranteed her absolute freedom. The crushing weight that had suffocated her spirit for an entire agonizing year had completely vanished, leaving her chest light. Yet her heart remained incredibly full, trembling with a sudden, beautiful vulnerability that was entirely new to her. Beside her, Silas Vance held the leather reins with a casual, effortless mastery, his towering silhouette bathed in the golden aura of the western sun. He did not boast of his magnificent victory, nor did he look back at the town he completely brought to its knees with his quiet, righteous power. He simply looked forward, his piercing steel-blue eyes scanning the horizon with the peaceful serenity of a man who had finally found exactly where he belonged. Every now and then, his gaze would drift to Clara, observing her quiet reflection with a deep, reverent tenderness that made a delicate, warm flush rise to her cheeks, igniting a sweet, healthy tension that throbbed softly between them in the quiet spaces of the frontier evening. When the wagon finally rolled into the familiar yard of the homestead, the property no longer looked like a crumbling monument to a tragic past. The freshly mended fence line stood straight and true against the sky. The heavy barn door was perfectly secure on its iron hinges, and the simple timber cabin looked like a genuine sanctuary, waiting to shelter them from the coldness of the outside world. Silas brought the horses to a gentle halt and stepped down from the wagon, his heavy boots hitting the earth with that familiar, comforting thud that had become the sweetest sound in Clara's lonely world. He walked around to her side, extending his massive, calloused hand to help her down. Clara placed her small, delicate hand in his, but as her feet touched the ground, she did not immediately step away to retreat into the safety of the house. Instead, she stood close to him, looking up into the strong, chiseled angles of his rugged face, her dark eyes shimmering with a profound emotion that defied simple words. The immense physical strength of him was a magnificent shield, but it was the deep, unyielding beauty of his protective soul that completely captivated her, pulling her toward him with the irresistible, magnetic force of true love. "Silas," she whispered softly, her voice carrying a sweet, trembling resonance in the quiet valley. "You have given me back my home. You have restored my honor before the entire world. And you have broken the invisible chains that kept me entirely invisible and drowning in shame. But the greatest gift you have given me is a realization that I am not a ruined, worthless thing destined to fade into the dust. You saw me when I was completely forgotten, and you made me feel worthy of being saved. How can I ever hope to repay a man who has given me my very life back?" A slow, beautifully warm smile touched the corners of Silas's mouth, completely softening the fierce, rugged lines of his frontier features. He did not withdraw his hand. Instead, his long, warm fingers gently intertwined with hers, his grip completely secure, providing a grounding, magnificent comfort that shattered the very last remnants of her lingering fears. You owe me absolutely nothing, Clara, Silas replied, his deep, resonant voice dropping to a rough, intimate rumble that vibrated straight into the hollow, aching spaces of her heart. I did not use that gold to purchase a debt, and I certainly did not stand against Elias Thorne to earn a reward. For 10 lonely years, I traveled the wilderness with a heart as cold and barren as the winter mountains, believing that my own capacity for joy had died long ago in the frozen dirt of Wyoming. I thought my strength was meant for nothing more than breaking wild horses and enduring the elements. He stepped closer, closing the final inch of distance between them, until Clara could feel the steady, powerful heat radiating from his broad chest, enveloping her in an absolute fortress of safety. He reached up with his free hand, his rough, weathered knuckles gently brushing a stray lock of raven hair away from her pale cheek, his touch lighter than a summer breeze, yet filled with a fierce, undeniable devotion. The moment I rode into this yard and looked into your beautiful, courageous eyes, I realized my strength had a far greater purpose, Silas whispered, his steel blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that took her breath completely away. You did not need a savior, Clara. You needed an ally, someone to stand in the gap while you remembered how to fight for yourself. Watching you stand tall in that bank, watching you demand the respect you have always deserved, completely healed the broken spaces inside my own soul. If you will have me, I want to spend the rest of my days building a new foundation on this fertile earth with you. I want to work this land beside you, protect you from every storm, and love you with every ounce of strength in my lungs. You are the home I have been searching for across 1,000 miles of wilderness. The profound, life-altering beauty of his vow completely overwhelmed Clara, washing away the final, stubborn traces of her self-doubt, and replacing them with a magnificent, unyielding sense of self-esteem and inner strength. She understood now that true healing did not mean forgetting the tragedies of the past, but rising above them, transforming the scars of resilience into a beautiful beacon of hope. She was no longer the tragic, isolated widow carrying a dead man's mistakes. She was a beautiful, powerful woman, deeply loved, fiercely valued, and completely ready to embrace the magnificent future they would build together. I will have you, Silas, she breathed, a radiant, triumphant tear escaping her eyelashes to shine like a diamond in the twilight. With all my heart and all my soul, for as long as the mountains stand. Silas let out a slow, deep breath, a profound wave of relief and pure happiness washing over his rugged face. He moved his large hands to her waist, his grip perfectly tender yet unyielding, and pulled her slender frame fully against the solid, warm expanse of his chest. Clara wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, burying her face into the clean, masculine scent of his neck, completely surrendering her fragile soul to the magnificent, forever love of her cowboy. They stood together in the center of the quiet yard, two resilient souls forged in the fires of frontier adversity, completely redeemed and united in a profound, unbreakable bond that would weather any storm the Wild West could ever bring. The sun finally dipped below the western horizon, leaving behind a sky filled with a brilliant, endless tapestry of twinkling stars that lit up the vast American frontier. The story of the Linwood homestead was no longer a tale of loneliness and ruin, but an inspiring testament to the incredible power of resilience, the beauty of self-worth, and the ultimate victory of a love built on absolute truth, honor, and mutual devotion. Through the darkness of despair, hope had emerged triumphant, pointing the way toward a beautiful, peaceful dawn.